The morning light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Capitol Hill office, casting long shadows across the polished conference table. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett sat with perfect posture, reviewing briefing papers for the upcoming Judiciary Committee hearing. Her office hummed with quiet efficiency, legislative aides moving between meetings, phones ringing with constituent concerns, the occasional staffer stopping by her open door with a quick question that needed her insight. This was her element, the calm before the storm, the preparation that underpinned her reputation for being unflappable. When the cameras rolled, Jasmine glanced at her watch, a slim silver timepiece that had been her grandmother's, and made a note in the margin of a policy brief. Her presence carried an understated authority, not from raising her voice but from the measured precision with which she spoke and moved. 3 years into her term, she had earned respect even from colleagues across the aisle for her legal acumen and ability to distill complex issues into clear language. Congresswoman, her chief of staff Marcus appeared at the door. Director Whitfield from the Justice Department Oversight Committee is here for your meeting. Jasmine looked up, nodding once, sent him in. Please, and could you join us? I want your notes on this. Marcus stepped aside as Richard Whitfield entered the office at 58. Whitfield had the comfortable bearing of someone who had long navigated the corridors of power. His tailored suit and the casual way he extended his hand suggested both the privilege of his position and his assumption of welcome. Congresswoman Crockett, thank you for making time today. His smile was practiced diplomatic. I know how packed committee weeks can be. Director Whitfield. Jasmine stood, gesturing to a chair across from her. I appreciate you coming to the Hill. Marcus, would you mind closing the door? The three settled into a triangular arrangement around the conference table, sunlight now catching the framed law degree and bar admission certificates on the wall behind Jasmine's desk. Whitfield's eyes lingered momentarily on the photographs beside them. Jasmine, with community organizers from her district standing on the steps of the courthouse from her days as a defense attorney. I've reviewed your department's quarterly report. Jasmine began, opening a folder with highlighted sections. There are some discrepancies I'd like to address before the public hearing next week. Whitfield leaned back slightly. Of course, though, I must say the report was thoroughly vetted by our statistical division. I'm confident in its accuracy. I'm not questioning the math. Director. Jasmine's voice remained even. I'm questioning the framing. On page 47 you cite a 20% decrease in civil rights complaints as evidence of improvement in departmental practices. Marcus slid a document toward Whitfield, who glanced at it without picking it up. Those are the numbers we've recorded, Whitfield said. It's objectively good news. Jasmine placed her pen down with deliberate care. What your report fails to mention is that this decrease coincides precisely with the new online reporting system that was implemented last quarter, a system that my office has received numerous complaints about. The interface is confusing, particularly for elderly constituents and those with limited English proficiency or technical access. Whitfield's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Congresswoman, every new system has a learning curve. We've provided instructional materials in multiple languages, instructional materials that require internet access to download. Jasmine replied. She pushed another document forward, a spreadsheet of constituent communications. What we're seeing isn't fewer civil rights violations, Director. We're seeing fewer successfully submitted complaints. The air in the room shifted subtly. Marcus watched the exchange with the stillness of someone who had witnessed this pattern before, the moment when Jasmine's preparation revealed the cracks in someone's carefully constructed narrative. Whitfield cleared his throat. I think you might be making assumptions about causality here, Congresswoman. Our analysis suggests I'm not making assumptions, Director. I'm presenting evidence. Jasmine's tone remained conversational, but her eyes held his. My office conducted a survey of community organizations in 3 districts, including mine. 76% of respondents who attempted to file complaints reported system timeouts or errors. That data isn't reflected anywhere in your report. A slight flush crept up Whitfield's neck. With all due respect, Congresswoman, a survey conducted by your office doesn't meet the same methodological standards as our federal data collection. The room fell silent for a moment. Marcus shifted slightly in his chair, recognizing the pause that often preceded Jasmine's most effective moments in committee hearings, that brief space where she allowed implications to settle before responding. Interesting that you mention methodological standards, Jasmine Jasmine finally said she flipped to another tab in her folder because according to your department's own guidelines for data collection practices section 4.3, any system change that could impact reporting metrics should be clearly annotated in the analysis and controlled for in year-over-year comparisons. She looked up. That didn't happen here. Whitfield's expression hardened. He straightened his tie, a nervous habit, before responding. Congresswoman Crockett, while I appreciate your thoroughness, I think we need to maintain perspective. The overall trend lines are positive. Perhaps, instead of focusing on administrative minutiae, we could discuss the substantial progress being made in community relations there. It was the subtle dismissal, the reframing of meticulous oversight as nitpicking, the implicit suggestion that she was missing the forest for the trees. Marcus watched Jasmine's hands, which remained perfectly still on her notepad. Administrative minutiae, she repeated softly, letting the phrase hang in the air. That's an interesting characterization of civil rights enforcement director. She didn't trace her voice. She didn't need to. The weight in her words filled the room more effectively than any volume could have. Last month I met with Mrs. Eliza Johnson. She's 84 years old, a retired school teacher from my district. She tried 7 times to file a complaint about housing discrimination after being denied a lease renewal in her building of 29 years. The new online system timed out each time she tried to upload her supporting documentation. Jasmine maintained unwavering eye contact with Whitfield on her 8th attempt. Her grandson drove 40 minutes to help her. They finally submitted successfully, only to receive no acknowledgement for 6 weeks. Jasmine turned a page in her folder with deliberate precision when they called the helpline, which is only staffed 4 hours per day 3 days a week. They were told the complaint was in process. 3 weeks after that they received a form email stating the complaint was being dismissed for insufficient documentation. She looked up. Mrs. Johnson has lived in my district her entire life. She taught mathematics to generations of children. She marched in Selma, and your department just reduced her experience to a statistical improvement. Whitfield shifted uncomfortably. I can't speak to individual cases without reviewing the file. If you'd like to send her information to my office, I already did 6 weeks ago. Jasmine closed her folder along with 17 similar cases. My office has yet to receive a substantive response. The subtle dismissal and Whitfield's demeanor crystallized into something more visible, a flash of irritation that he quickly masked behind professional courtesy. Congresswoman, he said, leaning forward, his voice taking on a tone of practiced patience, I understand you're passionate about constituent services. It's admirable, but you must understand that we're managing a national system with millions of interactions. Some cases will inevitably fall through the cracks, and we're always working to improve, but characterizing isolated incidents as systematic failures isn't productive for either of us. The condescension in his tone was so familiar that Marcus could practically predict the exact moment it would appear in these meetings. The implicit message was clear: you're overreacting, you're making this personal, you're not seeing the bigger picture. It was rarely stated outright, and that would be too obvious, but conveyed in tone, in the slight head tilt, in the subtle shift from colleague to explainer. Jasmine said nothing for a long moment. The sunlight had shifted, no longer illuminating the conference table but now casting half the room in shadow. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, measured, and carried a weight of absolute clarity. Director Whitfield, there's nothing isolated about 18 cases from a single congressional district in a single quarter. She opened her laptop and turned it toward him. And there's nothing isolated about the 342 similar cases that have been documented by the Congressional Black Caucus members since her new system was implemented. On the screen was a spreadsheet meticulously organized, color-coded with timestamps and case numbers. Whitfield's eyes widened slightly. We've been comparing notes, Jasmine continued, cross-referencing constituent complaints, building our own database since yours apparently isn't capturing the full picture. She pressed a key and the screen displayed a map with color-coded districts. The failure rate of complaint submissions correlates almost perfectly with districts that have higher percentages of elderly residents, limited English proficiency, and limited internet access. In other words, Director, your system is failing the very communities most vulnerable to civil rights violations. Whitfield stared at the screen, the comfortable certainty draining from his expression. I wasn't aware aware of this analysis. That much is evident from your report." Jasmine replied. She closed the laptop gently. "Which brings me back to my original concern. A 20% decrease in civil rights complaints isn't a success story if it represents barriers to access rather than actual improvement. Calling this progress isn't just statistically inaccurate, it's harmful. It creates a false narrative that problems are being solved when they're actually being buried." The room fell silent again. Marcus watched as Whitfield's expression cycled through several emotions: defensiveness, confusion, and something that looked almost like embarrassment. The director cleared his throat. "I'll need to review this data with my team," he finally said. "I'll have my staff send over the complete analysis." Jasmine nodded. "And I expect it will be addressed in next week's hearing." She closed her folder and stood, signaling the end of the meeting. "Because what I won't do, director, is sit quietly while your department presents misleading statistics that erase the experiences of my constituents." Whitfield stood somewhat stiffly. The dynamic had shifted. His earlier condescension now replaced with the watchful caution. "Of course, Congresswoman, we'll take this under advisement, not under advisement, director, into immediate action." Jasmine moved toward the door. "My office will be following up daily until we see the system fixes implemented and the report amended. Mrs. Johnson and every other citizen deserves nothing less." After Whitfield left, Marcus remained seated, making final notes. "He's going to call the committee chair," he said without looking up. "Of course he is," Jasmine replied, returning to her desk. "And the chair will call me, concerned that I'm being too aggressive before the public hearing." She checked her watch again, a habit from her courtroom days. "Schedule timed with our technical team. I want a walkthrough of exactly how the database comparison was built." "Whitfield will try to discredit our methodology." Marcus nodded, already typing the request. "The statistical correlation is solid. They can't dispute the numbers." "They won't dispute the numbers," Jasmine corrected. "They'll question whether the numbers matter. They'll say we're making a technical issue into a civil rights issue." She paused, looking at the photograph on her wall of her grandmother at her law school graduation. "Have the team prepare visual aids for the hearing: charts, maps, testimonials. I want every committee member to understand exactly who is being left behind by this system." The day of the oversight hearing arrived with the typical Washington pageantry crowd. It hallways, reporters stationed at strategic corners, staffers hurrying between offices with last-minute briefing papers. The committee room filled quickly, the gallery packed with observers, advocates, and the occasional curious tourists who had wandered into what promised to be a contentious session. Committee members filed and taking their places on the elevated. These aides whispering final points in their ears before retreating to seats along the wall. Director Whitfield sat at the witness table, flanked by two deputy directors and the department's general counsel. His expression was composed, but the slight tightness around his eyes betrayed tension. When Jasmine entered, several colleagues nodded in greeting. She took her seat, exchanging brief words with the Congresswoman beside her. Her materials were arranged with characteristic precision: color-coded folders, tablet loaded with a presentation, constituent testimonials flagged with yellow tabs. Marcus sat directly behind her, ready to pass additional documentation as needed. The committee chair called the hearing to order, moving through opening formalities before Director Whitfield began his prepared testimony. His voice carried confidently through the chamber as he highlighted departmental achievements, policy initiatives, and, as anticipated, the statistical improvements in civil rights metrics as outlined in our quarterly report. Whitfield said, gesturing to the document before each committee member, "We've seen a 20% reduction in civil rights complaints across all categories. This represents a significant improvement in departmental practice and community relations." Several committee members nodded appreciatively. The chair thanked Whitfield for his testimony and opened the floor for questions, beginning with senior members from both parties. The initial exchanges followed predictable partisan lines: Republicans praising efficiency measures, Democrats pressing on enforcement priorities. When Jasmine's turn came, the room subtly shifted. Those familiar with her work recognized the focused stillness that preceded her most effective questioning. She adjusted her microphone slightly, thanked the chair, and began without preamble. "Director Whitfield, I'd like to return to the 20% reduction in civil rights complaints that you've highlighted as a success metric. Can you tell the committee when your department implemented the new online reporting system?" If Whitfield was surprised by the question, he didn't show it. "The updated system was deployed at the beginning of this reporting quarter," he answered smoothly. "And did your department conduct any accessibility testing with elderly users, those with limited English proficiency or those with limited internet access before deploying this system. A barely perceptible hesitation. We followed standard federal guidelines for system updates, Congresswoman. That wasn't my question. Director Jasmine replied, her tone conversational but unyielding. Did you specifically test with those vulnerable populations before deployment? Whitfield glanced briefly at his counsel. Limited testing was conducted with diverse user groups. We can provide those reports to the committee. I would appreciate that. Jasmine nodded. Because my office has compiled data suggesting a direct correlation between the deployment of your new system and a significant increase in failed submission attempts from exactly those populations. She motioned to Marcus, who activated the large display screen beside the committee desk. A map appeared showing congressional districts color-coded by complaint submission failure rates. As you can see, districts with higher elderly populations, limited internet access, and limited English proficiency show failure rates 3 to 5 times higher than other districts. The room quieted as committee members leaned forward to study the visualization. Even those typically disengaged during technical discussions seemed to grasp the implications immediately. Director Jasmine continued, would you agree that a reporting system that disproportionately fails certain populations could create the statistical illusion of improvement when in fact it's simply creating barriers to access? Whitfield straightened. Congresswoman, while I appreciate your concern, I think you're making an unwarranted leap from technical difficulties to intentional barriers. I didn't suggest intent. Director, I'm speaking to impact. Jasmine's response was immediate, her legal training evident, and I find it troubling that you interpret a question about system functionality as an accusation of malice. A murmur ran through the gallery. Several committee members exchanged glances. Whitfield's expression hardened slightly. The department is committed to equal access for all citizens. If there are technical issues, we'll address them, but characterizing temporary system challenges as civil rights concerns seems excessive. The word hung in the air. Excessive, too much, overreacting. The implication was clear, and judging by the slight shift in several committee members' posture not lost on them, Jasmine allowed the moment of silence before responding, her voice still measured but carrying a new weight. Director Whitfield, I'd like to introduce you to someone. She motioned again, and the screen displayed a photograph of an elderly black woman standing proudly beside a school building. This is Mrs. Eliza Johnson, a constituent of mine, 84 years old, retired mathematics teacher, civil rights activist. Jasmine looked directly at Whitfield. Mrs. Johnson was denied housing renewal after nearly 3 decades in the same building. When she attempted to file a civil rights complaint through your new system, it failed 7 consecutive times. When she finally submitted successfully with assistance, her complaint was dismissed weeks later for insufficient documentation, the very documentation that your system had failed to upload properly. Jasmine turned a page in her notes. Mrs. Johnson is not a statistic director. She's not a temporary system challenge. She taught 3 generations of children in my district. She has arthritis that makes typing difficult. She has limited internet access, and your department's report just erased her experience by counting her inability to file a complaint as evidence of improvement. The chamber was completely silent. Now saw no. Director, I don't think it's excessive to characterize this as a civil rights concern. I think it would be negligent not to. Whitfield shifted in his seat, glancing at his counsel again before responding. Congresswoman, while I sympathize with Mrs. Johnson's situation, anecdotal examples don't necessarily reflect system-wide patterns. We're dealing with millions of interactions. This isn't anecdotal. Director Jasmine interrupted, her tone still even but broking no evasion. She motioned once more, and the screen changed to show a spreadsheet with hundreds of entries. This is a database of 342 similar cases documented by Congressional Black Caucus members in the last quarter alone. Each represents a citizen whose experience was effectively erased by your department's celebration of reduced complaint numbers. She leaned slightly forward. So I'll ask you again, would you agree that a reporting system that disproportionately fails certain populations could create the statistical illusion of improvement when in fact it's simply creating barriers to access? The gallery was utterly still. Every eye fixed on Whitfield. His momentary silence spoke volumes. It could potentially create such an illusion. He finally conceded if the implementation were flawed. Jasmine nodded once. Thank you for that acknowledgement, Director. She turned to the chair. I have specific recommendations for system improvements and reporting metrics that I'd like to submit for the record, along with our complete analysis of submission failure patterns. The chair nodded slightly, wide-eyed without objection as Jasmine concluded her questioning time. A ripple moved through the chamber, the subtle rustle of people who have just witnessed something significant. Several committee members who had been scrolling on phones now sat fully attentive. Reporters in the gallery were already typing rapidly. The hearing continued, but the dynamic had irrevocably shifted. Subsequent questioners from both parties referenced Jasmine's points, the visualization remaining displayed beside the D's. What had been framed as a departmental success story had been methodically recontextualized as a systematic failure of access. When the session concluded 3 hours later, committee members gathered their materials and began filing out. Several approached Jasmine briefly, some with congratulations, others with follow-up questions about her data. Director Whitfield departed quickly, surrounded by his team, their expressions tense. Outside in the corridor, Marcus matched stride with Jasmine as they moved toward her office. Her phone's been lighting up, he said quietly. Communications director says we're trending. Major outlets are requesting statements. Jasmine nodded. Tell her we'll stick to the facts. This isn't about viral moments, it's about getting the system fixed. Too late for that, Marcus replied, showing her his tablet. On the screen was a social media post already accumulating thousands of shares. Someone had clipped the exchange with Whitfield, adding the caption, "This is what accountability looks like. No raised voices, no theatrics, just undeniable truth." Jasmine glanced at it briefly before continuing down the hallway. "Schedule a call with Mrs. Johnson. She should hear about this directly from me, not from the news." As they reached her office, a junior staffer approached with a message slip. Director Whitfield's office called. He's personally requesting a meeting tomorrow to discuss system modifications. Jasmine took the slip, a slight smile crossing her features for the first time since the hearing began. "Schedule it," she said, "and make sure our technical team is present. We're not just going to identify problems, we're going to solve them." Later that evening, after calls and briefings had concluded, Jasmine stood at her office window. The Capitol dome was illuminated against the night sky, a symbol of ideals not always realized in practice. Her grandmother's watch showed nearly 9:00. Another long day in a career built on them. Her phone buzzed with a text from her sister. "Saw you on C-SPAN today. Grandma would be proud." Jasmine smiled, thinking of the woman who had taught her that dignity wasn't just about keeping your composure when challenged, it was about standing firmly in truth even when others tried to reframe it as excessive, emotional, or unimportant. It was about recognizing that some words carried the weight of lives behind them. She typed a response, "Just doing my job," following her example. Then she gathered her things, turned out the lights, and headed home. Tomorrow would bring another round of meetings, another set of challenges requiring the same careful precision. The work of transformation wasn't in dramatic confrontations or viral moments, it was in the methodical dismantling of systems that buried truth beneath comfortable statistics, and in that quiet persistence was a power that no dismissal could diminish.